kick off then. Okay, welcome all to this fourth session of our Lent term Dorothy Garrod seminar series at the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge. If you're joining us for the first time, this term series is titled The North Atlantic Highway, Materiality and Mobilities Throughout Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And it aims to center the North Atlantic as a binding force that has permitted a diverse array of mobilities and immobilities across time that have resulted in the complex cultural mosaic of the present-day North Atlantic world. Our series is framed around the different perspectives of the circum-Atlantic and invites scholars discussing the following regions: the Atlantic Americas and the Caribbean, Atlantic Africa, and Atlantic Europe. My name is Oliver Anchak. I'm a co-organizer of the series, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the department focusing on heritage studies in the Southern Caribbean. It's my pleasure to introduce you today to our speaker, Alissandra Cummins, whom I am academically greatly indebted to for her groundbreaking work on heritage and museum studies in the region. But before I turn to introduce our speaker, there's just a few housekeeping points to go over. Today's talk will last about 1 hour and will be followed by a 30-minute question and answer session led by my co-organizer, Joshua Fitzgerald. Please keep your microphone turned off. The chat will be disabled during the presentation, but will be turned on again during the Q&A. The event will be recorded, so please keep that in mind and keep your cameras on or off as you prefer. By remaining in the room as we are recording, you consent to be recorded, and the recording will be available on the department's YouTube page, which you should find in the chat. During the Q&A session, if you would like to ask a question, please use the chat function to send a message to the general chat, and we will read it aloud, or you can raise your hand and we will call on you, and in that case, you can unmute yourself. Captioning has been enabled for the event. If you'd like to have captioning, you can select it at the bottom of your screen where it says live transcript. Please note that the captions are provided by Zoom, so we can't be held responsible for the accuracy in all cases, but you will be able to revisit the event later on YouTube. And we're doing our best to provide an inclusive environment in this online event. So it goes without saying that all attendees are expected to show respect and courtesy to the speaker and to each other throughout the event. Otherwise, we will have to boot you from the event. Now, with all of that out of the way, it's my great honor to introduce you to our distinguished speaker, Alissandra Cummins. Alissandra Cummins is the director of the Museum and Historical Society of Barbados and is internationally recognized in matters concerning heritage, museum development, and art. From 2004 to 2010, she served as president of the International Council of Museums, ICOM, the first woman and the first person from the Caribbean to do so. She is immediate past editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Intangible Heritage, and she's also the president of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. Alissandra Cummins was instrumental in the creation of the Museums Association of the Caribbean, MAC, serving as founding president from 1989 to 1992. She was also active first as a board member and then as president of the International Association for Caribbean Archaeology, IACA. She also served as vice president of the Commonwealth Association of Museums and has helped design, develop, and deliver their distance learning program, most recently in 2018. She teaches museum and heritage studies at the University of the West Indies and currently is part of the advisory board of the International Network of the Slave Route Project. Ms. Cummins has represented Barbados as a member of the executive board of UNESCO from 2011 to 2013, which she chaired from 2012 to 2013. And she's also served as chair of UNESCO's Intergovernmental Committee for the Promotion of Return of Cultural Property to Countries of Origin, or its restitution in case of illicit appropriation from 2003 to 2005. Between 2008 and 2011, she served as rapporteur and vice chairperson on the World Heritage Committee. In 2007, she was appointed president of UNESCO's International Advisory Board Memory of the World MOW program, and more recently, she was appointed to the board of UNESCO's newly established International Center of Documentary Heritage, ICDH. She currently serves as the chairperson of the Barbados National Commission for UNESCO and deputy chairperson of the Barbados World Heritage Committee. Alissandra Cummins is a fellow of the Museum Association UK, an honorary member of ICOM, and a member of the Commonwealth Association of Museums Cowrie Circle, and she's been awarded Barbados's Golden Crown of Merit in 2006 in recognition of her services to the development of heritage and museums. Alissandra, thank you for joining us today, and with that, I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Oliver. And I'd like to say that having outlined all the various hats I've worn, I think I want to be very clear to acknowledge that A, I'm not an archaeologist, even though I presided that group. B, I am very much happy to explore issues that relate to the way in which archaeology is interpreted and understood, particularly in a museum setting. And really and truly, my interest in this session, and I have to say, I'm so thrilled to have had being able to participate in the earlier sessions, because there's such a lot of material that binds these various presentations together when we talk about the North Atlantic, or indeed the Atlantic. Before I begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge and pay tribute to the work and legacy of the late Peter Druitt and his team, and his contributions to Barbados archaeology in the way in which he was able to advance the work of the Archaeological Survey of Barbados for almost, I think it's just over 20 years. I'm particularly pleased to see Mary Hill Harris join us. And she was the contributor through Cambridge, University of Cambridge, who joined us from the 1990s onwards, I think, Mary Hill, and contributed to that work. Sorry, I can't hear you, Mary.
1985.
1985, sorry,
Yeah.
1985. So she's been with us for a long time. The point here, though, is that Peter's work and the work of the Archaeological Survey still continues to resonate with us today, because so many of the authors and archaeologists who continue to work in the Barbados and Caribbean setting have come to us through the work that they initiated with Peter. So I want to acknowledge and understand that. Now, in exploring this theme of the seminar series, one could be said that's been designed specifically to interrogate many of the issues which preoccupied Barbadian poet and historian, cultural theorist, Edward Kamal Brathwaite, who was interested in what unified the diverse Caribbean before colonialism fractured it. In a 1991 interview, he stated, the Caribbean, although artificially divided into English-speaking, French-speaking, Dutch-speaking, Spanish-speaking, is really part of a whole underground continent of thought and feeling and history. Emphasis on the underground thought and feeling and history. Because to me, this is where the link between what he is articulating in poetry and history and other thought really articulates very well with the notion of how archaeologists join together what they find and how they think in the way in which that material culture that is revealed or through the bones of both individuals and animals and the detritus of the food that was eaten, all of these actually align very well with the way in which Kamal Brathwaite wished to explore the fundamental underpinnings of what was the Caribbean. The people of the Caribbean, he said, needed to rediscover this, and noted that instead of developing a sense of ourselves, he said, we developed a false sense of Europe. He spoke many times of the hidden subterranean culture, language, alongside life-giving water, which in Barbados flows underground, it's not surface water, which were essential life-giving features of his island, Barbados. And I've taken this characteristic of Barbadian culture and historical landscape and Brathwaite's efforts to unearth what lay beside or what lies alongside the work of archaeology to respond to the questions many may have regarding its existence. So my approach to this talk has also been very much influenced by the role that my museum has had to play in developing new exhibits, actually from the time Mary Hill joined the team in '85 and down to the present. Because when we think about the processes of museum making or exhibit making at that time, and the new approaches which we as an institution are taking towards the co-curation of new national narratives to inform the content of our permanent exhibits, which are under review and are going to be replaced within 2 years. When we think about this, we also need to look at the ways in which we now move from this authoritative framework of informed decision-making to understanding that our responsibility is to enable and allow the involvement of our community as co-curators in that process. My third point here is also to recognize that while an archaeology of migration is implied in the theme of this seminar series, and while my abstract points to the focus with Black unfreedom as articulated by Elsa Goveia in 1959, and Anne, you can start the slides. This does not exclude this does not exclude the other groups who were similarly migrated to Barbados. And on the contrary, at present, Anne, on the contrary, one can only understand the social and legal and cultural framework in which we are undertaking this work together. And the condition of slavery is very much, it's not just the factor of the individual who was enslaved, but it is very much conditioned by the lives and conditions of those around them. So no one escapes this matter of freedom and mobility. Next slide, Pam. So Elsa Goveia very much understood that mobility was the key issue, and how that was undertaken is very much the way in which we are going to understand how we treat enslaved people in this particular process. I will pause just very briefly so you actually are able to read this, and note that the image that is shown at the top left of the slide, yes, this one, this is an 1894 image of an individual called Boxall. And Boxall was the last remaining person who came out of enslavement in Barbados that we have this kind of visual record for. So it was an important moment to acknowledge it. On the right-hand side is one of the monuments that has been installed at what we call Rock Hall, which was the site of the first Freedom Village in Barbados, and very much a part of the framing understanding of the government in trying to recognize what remains hidden underground. What I want to also draw to attention in the broadest possible way is to use the lens to examine the subject, to hopefully convey that it was through a series of dialectical shifts from pre-Columbian times to the modern period. I don't dare go into the 20th century. We would really have, we would never end. That we come to understand the Caribbean's central role in traversing the North Atlantic. Next slide, and you can scroll through them. Here are some of the framing points that I take as the thoughts behind the way in which I've approached this subject matter in terms of the role of archaeology. There was just so many things I wanted to say, but key for a museologist is that we have been taught to rely on the written record, only to be taught later on that the written record comes from very, very biased accounts, not necessarily knowingly, but definitely biased in a number of different ways. So ledgers, bills of sale, runaway slave ads, all of these speak to the condition of individuals in the Barbadian space. But of course, archaeology has been a way of helping us to balance out the framework in the way in which we understand the human condition in the island. And therefore, the role of archaeology is critical to developing an understanding of the lives and experiences of both migrant and forced and free, and to fully appreciate their place in the history of the Caribbean and indeed the world. Now, this presentation, I have to say, is a very simple, unscientific representation of the movements in, around, and away from the Caribbean, primarily as a reminder that whereas museum exhibits tend to regard and treat the central narrative as fixed in time, as unmoving, as settlers really settled and never were anywhere else. In fact, the archaeological record and other written records do point to something quite different. And so we wanted to understand the movements of people to basically look for a better life. Next slide, please, Anne. So what I'm looking at really is to understand that it is through a series of dialectical shifts that we come to understand the Caribbean's central role in traversing the North Atlantic highways. And in this regard, I focus on the movements of diverse peoples moving into and out of the region, primarily those who were represented on the archaeological record to date. But for this presentation, I particularly wanted to reference the excellent work that lies alongside the archaeology also in terms of writing. I wanted to also point out that, again, when we look at archaeological remains, and particularly, more importantly, when we interpret them in a museum setting, we tend to understand them as coming, these artifacts coming from a singular cultural framework, when in fact, nothing could be further than the truth. The concept of transculturation, as first articulated by Cuban anthropologist Fernando Ortiz Fernandez in the 1940s, and has been revised and updated, but it also looks at the imbalances that continue to assert themselves in a number of locations, and offers his prescription as an alternative to acculturation, explaining that when a dominant culture imposes its ideas and practices on another, both are transformed through the multi-directional reciprocity of the exchange. So I am very, very grateful. I want to acknowledge the work a number of dedicated archaeologists and theorists who have helped to reframe Barbados as not the backwater that it was once thought of, but as centrally engaged in this process of making a landscape their own, their home, and that the sharing of cultural ideas and practices really is what informs what emerges as Caribbean culture. Next slide, Anne. The excellent work that has been produced as a result of decades of archaeological research has been encompassed in the work, the publication, the 2019 publication called Pre-Colonial and Post-Contact Archaeology in Barbados. Let me say that I'm going to race through a number of archaeological reports. I am not the author of these. I'm grateful to the authors of them. But if you really want to understand the work that is being done in Barbados, then that publication offers you the best opportunity to have it available to you in one place. And I very much want to again indicate that this slide references, next slide, references the work of Peter Druitt and Mary Hill of the Archaeological Survey, and the start of this process that I am detailing is outlined there. And the work that went into understanding the prehistory of the island was critical in removing us, as I said, from a backwater to actually a very well-established community of, for want of a better term, please forgive me, Amerindian peoples who invested in settling in Barbados. Next slide, please. I do want to recognize that the work that is outlined in the publication, as I said, started very much with Peter Druitt, and I have to point out that the historical archaeology that we're going to get into more thoroughly was critically framed by the work of Jerome Handler, Lang, and Robert Corricini, who undertook surveys at Newton. We're going to look at that later on, but the organizational framework of archaeology in Barbados really was started with Peter and his team. And our understanding has grown enormously from thinking that the prehistoric settlement of the island was really very much in the pre-Christian era, to understanding that the depth of the and significance of the settlement pointed to the archaic age of archaeology. In other words, about 4,000 years ago. Next slide, please. So with this in mind, I've taken a few liberties. And I really want to point out that while I am absolutely drawing attention to the ways in which we examine archaeology, the historic archaeology that I was referring to in Barbados, I am also looking through the lens of both the history and also recent contacts, people reaching out from both Africa, Europe, and North America to understand. They too want to understand the connections. And I think there's a prime opportunity for us to recognize where did Barbadians go from here, and to see that they obviously, through a process of transculturation, probably had an impact elsewhere beyond their island. Next slide. Oh, sorry, this one. Let's focus on this one. So we we look first here at this slide of the African burial ground, which occurs at the Pierhead site in Bridgetown, near the Greenwich. And the space is a car park. What has happened, though, is that we have very much benefited from some rescue archaeology that occurred here and is referenced in a number of articles, because this was a location where the Royal African Company had its barracks near the beach and inland from there, from 1660 to 1810. So metropolitan Bridgetown has obviously a lot to reveal in terms of the archaeology of both the urban population, but also newly arrived Africans in Barbados. Next slide, please. A lot of what we need to look at is not just then the archival study, but the archaeological and the oral memory. And these three things come into mind when we are talking about the complexity of putting together multi-layered histories in a museum setting. So plantation archaeology is very much what you would expect to be understanding in the historic era in Barbados. Next slide, and we wanted to recognize that as much archaeology is being done front and center in places like St. Nicholas Abbey, Colleton House, and other plantation settings, we need to understand that these archaeologists have also been exploring, next slide, not just what is dug up on the front lawn of the plantations, but what also they have encountered in the settings of the enslaved villages around them. And more importantly, and we'll come to that in greater detail, what goes on in what we call the gullies behind the historic houses, because the gullies are where a lot of activity occurs that we never even thought about as needing to understand historically in the museum setting or even in the historic setting, not until fairly recently. Next slide, please. And then we also needed to take account of these dialectics. When we look at the settings of not just enslaved Africans and enriched Europeans that for Barbados came primarily from England, but also from Scotland and Ireland. And here, can we really understand plantation Barbados without understanding the situation, obviously, of enslaved Africans, but also the descendants of what we call the poor whites or the redlegs. This is a work being undertaken by Matthew Riley at the moment, which is incredibly important in then recognizing that the conditions under which people who were captured, who were prisoners of war out of the settings in the 1640s, 1650s in Ireland and Scotland would not have come necessarily, would not have come as freed people. Some of them came as indentured laborers, but others came under lock and key. Others were Barbados, in other words, in very, very tenuous situations. And some of them remained and entrenched themselves, but often in these rocky outcliffs. Below cliff is the site that we're looking at. and very much in inhospitable conditions, as bad as those of the enslaved workers. And the enslaved workers may have had the better at some points because they were considered more valuable to the plantation to maintain and ensure they were fed and medically treated. So there's a lot that needs to go into our understanding of these 3 or 4 different groups that come into Barbados in the 17th century. Next slide, please, Anne. We also need to look at, this is another site where archaeologically we have looked and seen that many, the pottery clay works, the pottery manufacture in the British Caribbean and particularly Barbados, demonstrates very significantly the growth and development of the sugar industry, and thus the growth and development of the enslaved population, and very much associated with that are the poorer class of whites, in developing cottage industries that circulated and supported the development of the sugar and rum industry. I want to make a plug for, I think there should be more archaeology around rum. We need that. We need that encouragement. Fred Smith has done a wonderful amount of work, but we need to understand that people were not just living there and sipping water. Rum was very much part of the landscape. So this is a slide about Codrington Estates, and particularly the pot house that was associated with that particular plantation. I also want to point out one connection that I didn't make here, but we can see represented in the cultural landscape of Barbuda is the Codrington connection, the connections amongst many of the large landowners between Barbados and other sites in the Caribbean. And when you see those connections of planter class holdings, one has to understand and imagine that there were still continuities and exchanges going on between those locations, not just in terms of food or equipment, but other also people. People were moved. So Codrington Estates is very much linked with the fortunes of the Codrington Estates in Antigua and Barbuda. Next slide, please. We are, oh yes, so a couple of publications that as I said, on the left is the pre-colonial and post-contact archaeology of Barbados. And I also want to reference Matthew Riley's work on Archaeology Below the Cliff, which is dealing with the history of the Barbadian Redlegs, which again have revealed so much, such a rich interplay of fortunes and fellow feeling that we have to begin to engage, not so much with the way I was trained as you receive the archaeological refuge from one site. It's documented by the archaeologist before it leaves the field. It comes into the museum storehouse. It continues to be recorded as that particular site. And then, unless the archaeologist is particularly interested, they're not necessarily going to see the connections between that site and other sites, when in fact the specificity of that site may be shared, or maybe, if you like, complemented or better understood when you look at the material culture that's being associated from a number of different locations. And then again, I raise Kamal Brathwaite with the saying that he notes that within the tidal metaphor of historical and cultural equilibrium and disequilibrium is that nature of our catastrophe, the effects we feel have ancient subterranean but identifiable sources that our condition, frustration, exploitation, underdevelopment, slavery, colonialism, and our very sense of self and literature itself stems from the original empire on which we impinge and from which the metaphors of our public and official language flow. I'll let that settle while I ask Anne to move to the next slide. One thing that I think we must understand is that we cannot say that any one group came first, except perhaps for the pre-Columbian people, and that others came afterwards. No, they came together. They were part of the same system that drew from one wealth and appurtenances, and from the other drew their labor, their unwilling labor, their lives, their children and their grandchildren, and are represented in the forced migration that took place into Barbados from Africa. Next slide, Anne. Key among these locations, next slide, please, is Newton Plantation. And Newton, historically, should be understood and should be appreciated. The work of the group of researchers with Jerome Handler in the early 1970s should be understood as, I think it is understood as groundbreaking, as recognizing that it was not sufficient to appreciate the work of, or the lives of plantation owners or large holders, and it wasn't enough to recognize the prehistory of the island, prehistoric settlement of the island. We also need to understand how that wealth came to be accumulated through the presence, missing and marginalized until really the 70s, not just in the Caribbean, I have to say, but in North America particularly, until we understood that records such as the Newton burial ground and the bones and the artifacts that were drawn from that source, next slide please, played a role in our understanding and appreciation of the migration, forced migration of individuals coming to the island. But Newton also revealed other things. It wasn't just that individuals were brought from the west coast of Africa into the island and subsisted and died as a result of their labors, but the presence of, out of hundreds of glass beads from a European setting, we also needed to look at the presence of these two carnelian beads, because these carnelian beads were not produced in Africa, not produced in the Caribbean, not produced in Europe, but in Chambay, India, and thus were part of the East African trade. Now, how did they end up in sites uncovered in Barbados, along with, as I said, hundreds of other beads, bones, cowrie shells, fish vertebrae? How did they arrive? We have to understand the implications of that. Next slide, please, Anne. And it comes about as an understanding, I think that, sorry, go back to that slide, Anne. It needs to come about with our understanding that, again, the slave trade didn't occur just on the coast of West Africa, but was inflected with the introduction of individuals from the interior of Africa and even the east coast of Africa, trading inland across the continent into the West African region. But also we have to understand that there are records that do point out that enslaved Africans were brought from Madagascar into the Atlantic and even into Barbados. Now, this is a tiny thread. Comparatively speaking, we're not talking about a huge number of people here, but nevertheless, the implication of the kind of transcultural practices that will occur on the ground means that we do have to investigate, we do need to interrogate, we do need to better understand the connectivities that occurred in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries before we're able to put a final picture on these histories in Newton and elsewhere on the island. Still yet to be uncovered, I'm sure. Next slide, please, Anne. One other aspect that I began to refer to in the earlier part of the presentation is that we needed to also understand that archaeology on the plantation front lawn, and even in the burial ground of Barbados cannot be left solely to tell the story. We also need to understand the situation with caves, the subterranean aspect of what Kamal was referring to, also played a role in the subsistence of enslaved populations who were being very much forced to recognize that they were their best ability, unlike in Jamaica, Suriname, and elsewhere, where they were able to go into the hills and mountainous regions of those islands. The continued story up until recently was that Barbadians were very peaceful. They accepted their condition. They were not rebellious. We know that isn't true, but that they didn't resist. What we are finding, however, with the exploration of spaces like Maps Cave, and next slide, please, in terms of caves that were found next to Trent's plantation, a plantation that was very much recorded by 1643 and transferred from other crops which were less than successful in Barbados, tobacco and cotton. I mean, Barbadian tobacco was just, yeah, please don't bring that here. You know, it's just so bad, just don't. But they moved to sugar, and by 1643, Trent was partially under sugar. But in conducting the excavation of this English-style colonial farmstead, Doug Armstrong and his team also began to understand what was in the gully behind the plantation house, and a whole lifestyle existed. And next slide, please. Where we began to uncover the hidden histories of Barbadian Blacks was in the recognition that the caverns in the gullies next to the farmhouse, next to the plantation house, were revealing that alternative view that Brathwaite spoke about. And we are extremely grateful to Doug and his work for helping to establish that information that was recorded in Richard Ligon's 1647 publication on the early history of Barbados was not untrue. He was referring in the 17th century to the fact that caves were where escaped slaves moved to in order to try to avoid further conditions of slavery. He spoke to that. That record was ignored. It's now clear that the caverns underground, near to the plantations, also revealed a hugely significant part of the story. Next slide, Anne. What we need also then to recognize is that all of these sites that I've referred to have all come into play from the 16th century, from the 17th century into the work into the 18th and even 19th century. But I wanted to further acknowledge work that has been done in the center of Bridgetown, because the urban migration, the urban setting also reveals a series of, next slide please, of major focal points. We tend to downplay the story of the continued presence of Amerindians in Barbados because the story is clear, you know, the Europeans arrived with a few Africans, and when they arrived, Barbados was empty. And that therefore gave them permission to set up their plantations free of any conflict with living Amerindian populations that did threaten the existence of other European settlements elsewhere in the Caribbean. But there is a strong record of people coming with, being brought with Dutch and Portuguese, probably Jewish, all of Jewish origin coming into the island. They brought with them not just the technology to help develop the plantations, the sugar industry, but they also brought individuals, both African and Amerindian, who knew how to grow things, who knew how to survive in the conditions of the Caribbean, and who were essential to their survival and success on the ground. So we need to understand that, again, it was not a large majority of individuals coming into the plantation setting. And yes, Jericho is considered to be a very romanticized picture of this story, but it was not just Jericho who made part of this prescription. In the 1660s, the law of Barbados was clear in that you could bring people in from both the Americas, North and South. You could bring them in as enslaved labor. And while they didn't enjoy the title of chattel slavery, which has come to our understanding of how Black people were conditioned to this over centuries, nevertheless, they came in as enslaved labor. Next slide, please. So typically, they were coming in as part of the populations of Barbadian planters who had gone to Suriname, had gone to Brazil, and came back with some of their colleagues into Barbados as early as the 1630s. We have pictures of, and established a synagogue in Barbados by 1654. So we need to recognize again, what was the contribution of the Sephardic Jewish population that came into the island and settled from the 17th century into the early 20th century. And only, you know, the last of the Jewish population left the island around the 1920s to go to live with family, I think it was, in North America. There is a legacy there, and we have to understand also how the Jewish population intermingled both with Amerindians and with freed Africans, and created another population in Barbados, that we still, we still have Messiahs and Pereiras and other people with those Jewish names who were represented in the landscape. Go ahead, Anne. I know that we are running close to time. I'm very sorry. I'm trying to pick up. So then when we talk about pastures new, we also need to understand the outbound migration from Barbados, because as fast as they came into the island, a number of them were going out of the island. And so over the 17th to 19th centuries, we also see them removing themselves from the country. So very quickly, I'll go through the slides. We need to acknowledge that, for example, although this is towards the latter end of that out-migration movement, that the British West India Regiment formulated, next slide, quickly, formulated in the 18th century, was not formulated just for service in the Caribbean. They were sent abroad primarily to Sierra Leone and other parts of West Africa to help protect those colonies, those British colonies in Africa. Did they all come back? No. A lot of them stayed in Africa. So one of my tasks today was also to ask you to imagine what it would be like for us to better explore the contribution of Black West Indians who were first enslaved, were brought as enslaved laborers into the West India Regiment. Some of them eventually achieved a certain kind of freedom and even stature in the regiment. But many of them died or remained in Africa once the end of the development of these West India ranks was completed in the 19th century. Next slide, please. And so their material culture in Africa, we need to look at. Yes, they went to other parts of the Caribbean, but there were battalions, as I said, based in Sierra Leone that, it bears relevance to our understanding of who we are and where we went and how we developed as a people. Next slide, please, Anne. I'm going to have to run through these ones very quickly. I'm talking about then not archaeology that has occurred so far, but archaeology that perhaps could and should occur. One group of people who were leaving Barbados were also enslaved Africans who tried to escape slavery when they couldn't escape into the gullies, also escaped by a marine environment. They moved, they found their way out of Barbados to places like St. Vincent. They became part of the population of Black Caribs. They intermingled with the Amerindian population and became part of the Black Carib population of St. Vincent. They actually helped exercise quite a bit of control over that particular landscape to the fury of the European colonial powers, and were eventually, and only after that, next slide please, Anne, after being coerced and taken advantage of, they were only then removed from St. Vincent over to Roatan, off the coast of Belize and Honduras and what have you. So should we ignore the story, or should we begin to understand better how our Barbadian enslaved moved out of the country into these other locations? Shelter Island in off the coast or within the scope of Long Island also plays a part of this story, and we are actually in contact with the management and research staff there, because they want to also understand more about what what did Shelter Island really mean? I mean, Nathaniel Sylvester purchases it in 1651 and moves there by 57. He decides to live there, but he remains, and when he goes, he's not just going by himself, he's taking enslaved people with him, okay? So when he goes, does he remain disconnected? No, he is growing provisions, meats and crops and orchard and grain crops and other kinds of stuff, equipment, are all being transmitted from his settlement in this little island back to Barbados to help feed and maintain the enslaved population in the country that was so essential to the maintenance of power and control. Next slide, please. And of course, we can't leave this story without understanding the Barbados Carolina story, but I'm not, again, not trying to talk to you in terms of understanding a chronological sequence, because that's not how it occurred. People were moving into and out of Barbados within a couple of decades of being settled in Barbados. They were also moving out, a number of them seeking better lives, seeking greater enrichment in other cases. And the Barbados Carolinas connection is one of the ones that I think I need to speak least about, but which is being explored archaeologically in a number of locations, not just in Charleston, but also Cape Fear and Wilmington. Was explored for a number of seasons by Tom Lawfield, who wanted to understand the influence that Barbados may have played on the layout and character of the settlement. But also the continued connection, next slide, Anne. The continued connection between Barbados and Carolina remains critical and is being very well understood in a number of populations, a number of the citizens and the communities in the Carolinas. Here at Drayton's Hall, there are continued dedication to understanding and recognizing the role of Barbadian Blacks, not just in terms of their pottery, but also what they contributed to this story of being amongst the earliest enslaved Africans as cow hunters, or the first real American cowboys. Who thought of that? You know, we'd like to explore that story. I wouldn't mind a few of them here. Next slide, please. And it's not just the older population, it's the younger population who are getting to understand and appreciate more of the connections between these countries. The fact is that that's an enduring legacy that still requires further examination in a number of different ways, but not least with archaeology. Next slide, please. We're almost towards the end, Josh, don't worry. We also, Teresa, it's all your fault, but we also need to understand the role that Barbados played in terms of the repopulation of the area now called Liberia, and the role that Barbadians played in there, both white and black, but primarily black populations. And Matt Riley is very much critical to that research project to understand and investigate the material and political histories of the Back to Africa movement, which started in the 19th century, at least, in terms of Barbados's records. Next slide, please. But again, continues to be explored and witnessed in a number of different ways. We also want to understand the place of Codrington College in terms of recognizing how, this is continuing with Matt Riley's work in terms of Crozierville in Liberia and the essential presence of Barbadian migrants there. I would love to talk to you more about this one, but I know we're getting to the end of our time, so I really need to move on. but Matt's research has definitely revealed that there's still significant resources that require exploration, and not just the material culture, but also the stories that a number of descendants of the Black population still retain in their memory. Next slide, please. But Liberia wasn't just the other place, the only place that Barbadians went. Most recently, Prime Minister Mia Mottley led a team to Ghana, where many of the captured Africans had come from. And she established this very moving symbolic ceremony of Barbadians being reconnected with their ancestors on the West African coast by taking some of the soil from Newton burial ground to Ghana and having it reburied in an interment ceremony, which I think was very much appreciated by the Ghanaian population there. Next slide, please. When we talk about looking at past as new, again, we need to understand the explorations that have gone on with the connection between what we have called Bush Hill House, but this is the location that we've understood that George Washington did come to visit, did with his elder brother, did understand and did see and observe the critical presence of troops on the ground, did see how plantations were oriented and managed, did understand the kind of systems that would need to be put in place. And there's no doubt on the part of those who are responsible for the retelling of George Washington's story, of the critical role that his stay in Barbados played. And just go through very quickly. Again, the urban slave burial ground in Fontebelle was another telling of the story. I should say that the gully behind Bush Hill House also has important material to be revealed, still hasn't been explored properly. And then this urban site in Church Village was very revealing of a 19th century residential area where we see a lot of commercial activity taking place in the midst of Bridgetown, and still further research is to be undertaken. Next slide, please. I think we're at the last part of it. Oh, I think we're going to have to slide through this one because I'm way behind. The archaeology of fortification and control is also a major part of the archaeological work that's being undertaken. And we need to understand these spaces not just in terms of white soldiers and officers, but the Black recruits, the Black workers, the laborers who were also part of that landscape. Next slide, please, Anne. We need to get to the very end. We come back, this is the last part of the presentation. I'm sorry, Joss and Oliver, we're at the end. We are now back at Newton. Newton remains a critical space where Barbadians reconnect with their ancestors. In 2018, Asante King came to commune with our ancestors. So he came into Barbados specifically to go to Newton Plantation slave burial ground, poured libations, and asked for forgiveness and acknowledgement of the African role in the slave trade that brought some of our ancestors to Barbados. Next slide, please. We also see connections with the African-American Gullah Geechee population, whose Queen Quet came to Newton burial ground, I think in 2020, again, performing ceremonies and paying libations again to the ancestry, understanding that the connection was not just with the white population, but it was also with the Black population. So Newton remains a critical part of our retelling of the story. But the last part of it is that he who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past. We control the present. Prime Minister Mia Mottley has signaled the investment in a new memorial on the hills above the burial ground, where we will connect with this critical story at the international level. So play it for us, Anne. I'm not hearing the sound.
For he killed me, he shipped me regular.
Hearing the sound?
I
700
live with a bad man who love.
represent the burials that have
I
survived.
live with a bad man who Oh, I live with a bad man who love. For I go to the riverside regular. Masa baby won't kill me. Masa baby won't kill me. Masa baby won't kill me. For he killed me, he shipped me regular.
The song that you heard was recorded by Roger Gibbs based on an 18th century transcription by an English reverend who heard Barbadian laborers singing the song in the fields. And that record became part of an archival source in the UK. And it has recently been uncovered and has been registered on the UNESCO Memory of the World Register. But I want to finish this presentation by noting that in the wake of Barbadian's transition to a parliamentary republic, Prime Minister Mia Mottley announced on December 3rd, 2021, the creation of the Barbados Heritage District, including a memorial, a major global research institute, and a museum dedicated to accurately recounting the history and contemporary impact of slavery on Barbados and on the lives of individuals, cultures, and nations of the Western Hemisphere. It will serve as a cornerstone and catalyst for ongoing development of Barbados's independent identity, culture, and place on the world stage. And the Research Institute, which will be developed, will document Barbados' pivotal role in the systemic processes by which millions of Africans were forced into captivity and enslavement in the Caribbean and the Americas. Of special interest to all of you is that the architect and designer of the monument and the heritage structures is Sir David Ajayi, a Nigerian who has his own link to Barbados in the form of his very Barbadian wife. And we are deeply excited and thrilled to be working with such a visionary in the creation of this important memorial, not just to Barbadian history, but to the world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Everyone, I'm sure will have questions. I've just got a little comment there that I'm adding to the chat, but we do have time for some questions you can ask to Professor Cummins or to Dr. Cummins for your questions about the talk. Please, you may also submit them through the chat if you'd like us to read them for you on your behalf. But there's that raise hand feature underneath reactions that you may now go ahead and click on so that I can be aware that you have a question. I'm going to just change to my different gallery view so I can see if anyone's also, you may just like wave about. I have my own questions myself. I thought, it's just a powerful presentation at the end there with the video, but also, the idea of going along with what Professor Singleton had brought up in her first talk about diasporic movements and reverse migration. And so, it just brought up a lot of what I think this seminar series is doing best of, is connecting these communities and showing how complex mobility and migration and immobility can be with this community. So thank you so much. Let's see here. I want to go ahead and shut up so I can have some, oh, great, wonderful. Please, Dr. Mary Hill Harris, you go ahead and ask your question. Oh, and you're muted.
Yes, okay, I just found that. You said, Alissandra, that the memorial is going to be in the hills above Newton Plantation. Where is the actual museum to be? Is it going to be incorporated in the Barbados Museum or a separate site?
The Barbados Museum will be contributing to the design and development of that museum space. The monument, if you can imagine it, is just over the hill line above the burial ground. Okay, yeah. So that will be where the monument, but to the, I think to the right-hand side and further down hill will be where the research center and the museum and other spaces will be created, so that there's an association between the monument, the burial ground, and the and yes, over to the, in this image, it would be across the road below, this is the burial ground in the middle area here. And then across that dark brown area,
yeah,
across the road will be where the museum and the research center will be placed.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And go ahead and if you have a question, again, just use your raise your hand feature, or you can submit a question directly to me. I may still the floor, use my privilege as the Q&A leader here to ask one of my own questions. Yeah, maybe I'll just, if that's all right, Alissandra, I'll ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the, oh yeah, yeah, Maureen has a question. Go, Ms. Coleman, we want to ask your question?
Greetings from Belize. You could just call me sister. Respect to ancestors. I never hear no libation at the beginning. I know we have a responsibility for that. Respect, sister Alissandra, and all the people that will work with you, because even though we say your face, We respect that, that the ancestors' vibrations and our team of people support you. Salute to the work, real talk. Quickly, I wanted to know if there was a roadmap that has been used where community members work with museum management workers in a dignified way to create exhibits from an African perspective as opposed to a colonized mind perspective, because I'm tired of that, sister, in real talk.
Thank you for the question, and really greetings to you, my sister. Very, very good to hear your voice. What I want you to understand and imagine is that we have started this process, as I announced, of co-creation and co-curation of museum exhibits, and that particularly implies the communities of Barbados, and most particularly those of African descent, because as good as our historians have been over the last 20 years or more, it has not been possible to make it part of the storyline in a fixed, the fixity of permanent exhibitions is one of the critical factors that we have to move away from. And we have to find methodologies that are much more fluid, much more accessible, and much more a matter of building on the knowledge of individuals who are able to share family histories, family stories. And what I do see is that a lot more families are willing to bring us, their grandfather's tools, their mother's pottery, because they realize that the museum is now not just talking about the big men of history, but it is recognizing, acknowledging, and I have to say social media and a series of educational programs has been a big part of helping to transmit that message that our history is made by everyone. So I appreciate the message, and yes, it's very definitely a deliberate strategy, a deliberate policy that we are undertaking to ensure that there's a much more balanced view as to how history is not just told in the museum galleries, but also taught in schools.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that question. I've got a question from the audience here that I'll go ahead and read. You mentioned that some written records are good leads for sites to explore archaeologically. Have you found the oral traditions have also been helpful in this regard?
Actually, not that I have ongoing experience with this, but the only reason that Newton burial ground was found was because Handler, in his exploration, he was looking for a site. He looked here, at a couple of sites and couldn't find perhaps what he was looking for. And it was only in passing, and we're still trying to find the name of the individual who told him, he remembered that his grandmother said that the old people were buried over there. And it was, as you can see, the ground, and which is nicely trimmed at the moment, but it would have just been under grass. Who would have known? Well, only after that oral transmission did they eventually find older maps of that particular plantation, Newton plantation, and then begin to see the naming traditions that were undertaken, so that you could see Negro lower ground, Negro upper ground, and burial ground. And it's only then that they began to understand the implications of both the of these sites no longer having any external appearances, any external features, and began to find not just the burial ground, but also the enslaved village that lay on the other side that you didn't see, I'm afraid. But it is critical that we have that input in order to be able to tell those stories.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was really clear response to that. Other questions? I might just again try and still the moment for a second. Oliver, I'm asking my question first. So as far as the absence archaeology, I know you're not an archaeologist, but this concept of gullies and finding those marginalized sites in which you may find objects or use, I'm really fascinated by how you're able to recreate in sort of a museum experience for people what those spaces might have been like, how people interacted in those, the diversity, the complexity of people. Can you speak to that sort of museological sort of practice in recreating that absence archaeology? Okay.
So you know, a lot of what would I say? A lot of investment is being placed at the moment, not just in Barbados, but elsewhere, on digitization of archaeology, digitization of records. And that has its benefits in that you're able to see in one space, you know, representations of particular cultural links between objects, people, and historical spaces and what have you. I'm afraid I'm a little bit old-fashioned because I do like the real thing, however. So one of the things that I do very much appreciate Doug Armstrong undertaking, for example, in the Trent's Cavern that we showed you. Forgive me if I'm not quite clear on the technology, but 3D measurements were taken inside the cavern that will enable us, if we so choose, to reproduce all or part of the cavern within part of the exhibit. We have to look at that carefully though, because I do want, you know, in the same way that people want to be able to have some sense, or not always that they want, but they should have some sense of what it was like to be in the interior of a slave ship. I think people have to understand much more about how the enslaved population, in their efforts to escape, understood that they had to live their lives cloaked, masked, underground, and in darkness in order to be able to achieve some form of freedom. And so the change in lighting between these kinds of enclosed spaces and open air is going to be critical. The ability to perhaps recreate ambient sound that would have been transmitted from outside the cavern into the cavern. These are all part and party to that storyline that we have to look at. Yeah, thanks, Anne. So that's my answer to there.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Oliver, please. Yeah.
Well, thank you once again, Alissandra, for your wonderful talk. I was wondering, I wrote this down so that it comes out the right way. I'm wondering, particularly in light of the recent transition to a republic that Barbados just went through, what the role of the different histories that you've outlined is in a kind of canonization of a national memory, and particularly how that comes about in museum sector and museum collections as a heritage manager. And specifically, I also wanted to ask about the role of the indigenous past within this kind of, you know, building a kind of national canonized memory history and bringing all of these, you know, such distinct and complex stories that you've outlined that make up what Barbados is today, of course. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question, Oliver. So canonization of history, I think that's a critical phrase in there, because one of the key reasons why we are going to the population and saying, what do you want your story to be? What do you want your national story to be? Is because we as museum people have come to understand that we don't know all those truths. That we, while 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you might have been willing to say, yeah, we know what we want because the history book has been written, and therefore we're going to use a history book and some documents and we're going to get it straight. And you don't. And you learn through archaeology and other research, you begin to see other stories need to be revealed. So one of the things, Oliver, one trajectory I might point out is that we have begun dialogues. Then we're not just assuming that there's one community. For example, the East Indian population in Barbados, they're not seeing themselves represented in the current exhibits. They have had to go out and do their own research and encourage the generation of new histories. And they have been speaking to us about wanting to ensure that their story, primarily in Barbados' case, primarily late 19th, but very much more 20th century stories, are better incorporated into the national narrative and to see themselves reflected in that story. In terms of the Amerindian populations, we also have entered dialogues with them because they too live in Barbados. They too continue to see their connection back to people and population in the Guyanas. And they want to ensure that they are not neglected from the storyline. So actually there's quite a major campaign going on in terms of their recognition, not just through the museum, but through the national histories that are told, through the better understanding or articulation of heritage tours, for example, and the better accommodation of all of these differing stories into how we frame those historical experiences and into the contemporary. So I think the demand for much better, if you like, much greater recognition, due respect to everyone in the country, and definitely inviting different populations in different communities, different groups, different individuals to help us tell a better and more accurate story. These are all what we have been seeking to accommodate in making this a changed museological landscape. In terms of canonization, well, I think you can point out that while there were a lot of statues tumbled and pulled down in North America and in Europe, Barbados decided that we would take down Nelson. We actually decommissioned the statue and removed him with due ceremony of an African kind to another space. What we will do with that kind of monument, though, is that we're not prepared to just sort of pitch it in the ocean. It was part of our national story. But what we want to do is better balance the understanding of who actually saved, if you like, Barbados from the French in 1812, and better understand Nelson's incursions into an island that actually he despised, understanding his role as a naval officer and how his story becomes part of our story will be very much to us who are in control of the present to better control the past. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are, I just wanted to note that we're beyond time. Respecting everyone's time. I do feel we should wrap up soon, but I can't miss out on having Professor Singleton. Please ask your question, Teresa. And if you'd like, you can stay. Really quick before, I just want to note the next week's Garrod meeting is moved to 5 o'clock. In line with the industrial actions that are taking place. We want to avoid any concerns over that. And it actually turns out that Dr. Ogundiran will be here in Cambridge to present an in-person component alongside the Zoom feed. So, you can go to this Google Doc we posted in the chat box here to be some of the first to sign up for, register for a spot at the McDonald Institute where the live version will take place. But if you'd rather stay in the comfort of your home, Zoom is available there too. All right, thank you. And Teresa, please go ahead and ask your question. Thank you.
Yes, this is just a sort of very specific question. It builds on the idea, Jock's question on caves, and I was thinking particularly of map cave. There are two competing interpretations as to what went on there. Fred Smith talks about it as a place where enslaved people went to consume alcohol and possibly even make alcohol. And then Matt Riley feels that the bottles and containers were used to collect water from the dripstones. And I was just curious as to what maybe were some of your ideas about that.
Teresa, what I've come to understand is that while we tend to, I like this term Oliver used, while we tend to canonize particular elements of our national histories, that we have to better understand and appreciate the fact that most spaces were used for several different things. I'm not in a position to reduce one or the other either. I think what I would do in a museum setting is that I would actually want to explore to find the differing stories and to recognize that places of refuge were places where people felt that they could do a number of different things, where they might have worshipped, they might have had night outs at the party, they might have been playing. Fred found Mancala stones in one of his experts. All kinds of things. So whereas we in a museum setting and even in our personal houses or even in office spaces, we tend to require that a space be reduced to a singular purpose. That really wasn't the mentality at all. Actually, I found in neither the formal nor the informal spaces. And so I would really be prepared to look at both sides of the coin and perhaps find even a few more in between, because of course, we are talking about very male interpretations of the story. And I think not enough has yet been done in terms of understanding the gender-inflected use of spaces in Barbados and elsewhere. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. That was wonderful. Do you want to respect Alessandra's time? If you're fine with answering a few more questions, we could take a couple more questions, but otherwise, actually, just before that, let's go ahead and just give Alessandra one more big hand of applause for this wonderful talk and for sharing her research with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very kind. So any other questions or comments? I'd be very happy to take them. And Ryan, nice to see you there. It's great. I enjoyed your presentation too. There's just so much history. Sherilyn, nice to see you. Thank you. And Kate, yes. Okay, so Mary and Teresa have their hands up again, or is it that you haven't taken them down?
No, no, it is again. And
Okay.
if you don't, I'm just curious what the landscape is behind you.
Oh, this is the coastline, the east coastline from, oh gosh, I can't remember the name of the location, but it's on the east coast shore, you know.
I thought that. I just was curious what the big house was and so on.
I can't tell you offhand, I'm afraid, but I will message you and tell you. But
Thank you.
basically, I felt it was significant that I have this landscape behind me because this is the Atlantic Ocean meeting our shoreline. And
Yeah,
there's nothing between Barbados and Africa, just the sea. So
yeah.
it's very important.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Is it Harry Smith?
It's not, it's not quite Harry Smith, but it's near there. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Mhm.
Thank you once more, Alissandra. It really was a pleasure. And we look hopefully forward to seeing you at other events in the series as well, I think.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say, I do feel kind of outdone by, you know, having missed my visit to the pub.
Yeah.
Really, that was really important. So
There'll be another chance, another moment for sure.
okay.
Maybe
There's
stop
a
the recording.
pint will wait for you here.